Nintendo won the console wars of the 90s. However, that victory wasn't preordained. In fact, for at least a little while, Sega was beating Nintendo. In January 1992, Sega had a 65% market share of the home console market. Sega got there through excellent strategic positioning, great games, and savvy, edgy marketing. This included implying Nintendo fans were idiots, some pretty horrendous innuendo, ensuring that video game fans knew that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and through straight up lying. Right, lying. Just about all marketing campaigns lie, at least to some extent. But Sega took that lying to a whole new level in the advertising of one of their marketing campaigns: blast processing. Blast processing referred to a graphic process of the Sega Genesis. It sounded awesome! Here's the thing: it was quite literally never used in any Sega games. However, it was used heavily by Sega in their marketing. So let's start here. What the hell is blast processing? Well, let's start with this much. It was a real process. Blast processing wasn't just some made up nonsense term that Sega coined as part of an effort to make Nintendo look stupid or less technologically advanced. Blast processing, as it was referred to, wasn't a piece of hardware in and of itself. It was a special graphics technique. The technique itself was developed by Marty Franz, the technical director for Sega at the time. Franz and others knew that Sega's Yamaha VDP graphics processor was, in some ways, much more advanced than Super Nintendo's. It was faster, which meant higher resolutions, higher frame rate, 3D polygon graphics capabilities, and more. All of this meant that Sega had a pretty cool graphics capacity to begin with. However, from a color perspective, Sega was lacking. Depending on the game and the version of the system, the Super Nintendo could put 2 to 3 times more colors on screen at the same time as the Genesis. Enter blast processing. If the graphics card fired off, or blasted, a direct memory access at the right time, it could, in theory, put more data onto the scan line while graphics were being drawn. If done right, you could draw up to 256 color static images. This all sounds revolutionary, right? Here's the thing: it definitely didn't work reliably. No Sega game was ever shipped that had the so-called blast processing capability. Why? Well, technical limitations. The trick was cool, but the timing of when the direct memory access was fired had to be just right, as failing to do so could corrupt the image. Furthermore, doing it too often could result in cram dots, which were random pixels that would, again, corrupt the screen. In other words, the idea was great, but it couldn't be used reliably until later years when the Sega CD premiered. Scott Bayless, a Sega producer and technical advisor, said he's the one who inadvertently developed the term when he was being interviewed by Sega PR professionals. Bayless said, quote, "Sadly, I have to take responsibility for that ghastly phrase." So, during the run-up to the Western launch of the Sega CD, the PR guys interviewed me about what made the platform interesting from a technical standpoint. And somewhere in there, I mentioned the fact that you could just, quote, blast data into the DACs. Well, they love the word blast. And the next thing I knew, blast processing was born. Oi. All of this gets into a broader and funnier issue: how blast processing was used in marketing. To answer this, you have to understand exactly why Sega did so well at one point in the console war. Keep in mind that Sega was relatively unknown in many respects when it was first launched. The Sega Master System, that's the third generation system that competed with the Nintendo Entertainment System, sold between 10 and 13 million units. Not a small number. However, it was a fraction of the amount of systems that the Nintendo moved: 60 million units. In 1986, seeking to expand their international and American presence, Sega established Sega of America. They hired Tom Kalinske, a well-known toy executive, to be CEO of the company. Recognizing that they were well behind the market leader Nintendo, Kalinske reorganized the company and its marketing to think from a different and more aggressive perspective. This resulted in the development of a new game that was different than Nintendo and Mario in many ways. Sonic was cool. He had red shoes. He was edgier and had an attitude fitting the 90s. He was also fast. Really fast. And Nintendo was slow. Sega took this positioning and, no pun intended, ran with it, developing multiple marketing campaigns that essentially served as attack ads on Nintendo. Specifically, there was the Sega Does What Nintendo Don't ad campaigns. The ads hit Nintendo from multiple perspectives. Sega highlighted the games that they had that Nintendo did not, including Joe Montana Football, Pat Riley Basketball, Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, and more. They called themselves the One True 16-Bit System. And of course, they said this:
the Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
So, in that context, what was blast processing? Surely Sega explained the subtleties of the term and gave full context to its use, right? Exactly. Sega used blast processing in its advertising because it sounded cool. However, the term was vague and ambiguous. It simultaneously managed to sound like an impressive graphics trick and a marketing slogan. Of course, that belied the fundamental truth. Blast processing was a myth, a technological theory that couldn't be supported by the tech available at the time. Now, there is no question that the Genesis had certain graphical superiorities to the Super Nintendo. However, the reverse was also true. Super Nintendo could add more sprites, had better Mode 7 features. That's the process that allowed the foreground and the background to be rotated to create the illusion of depth, and the ability to simultaneously display more colors. When confronted with the Sega does what Nintendo don't and blast processing, Nintendo was pissed. They were angry at the way Sega attacked them. For example, in response to the Game Gear ads that basically called fans of the Game Boy fat, colorblind idiots, Super Nintendo tried to arrange protests by disability advocates. At one point at a toy conference in the 1990s, Sega and Nintendo executives almost came to blows after getting into an altercation over their devices. Nintendo responded to the blast processing controversy by launching an advertising campaign of their own. In 1994, they wrote an op-ed and paid for that op-ed to be in many video game magazines. That op-ed was entitled Smashing the Myth of Speed and Power, and basically nuked Sega for making up the term blast processing. The op-ed also said that the Super Nintendo was the technologically superior product. Of course, the op-ed was written by Nintendo, but you could only tell that by reviewing the little words that said advertising at the top and bottom of the page. The op-ed also made a number of claims that weren't accurate or lacked context. Holy crap, this is starting to sound like a fact check of a political commercial. Look, that's the crux of what blast processing really was. It was a marketing term about something that Sega would have loved to see work, but didn't have the tech to make happen. And, in a way, that makes Sega's use of blast processing from a marketing perspective all the more powerful. It was a made up term that a marketing guru heard and went, hey, that sounds pretty cool. And because of that, it was off to the races. Blast processing is emblematic of why Sega was, for a brief moment in time, able to beat Nintendo. They successfully differentiated themselves from the system, and the impact here is pretty clear. Blast processing helped make Sega sell better. In the end, blast processing became legendary within the larger video game community as a joke and symbolic of the height of Sega's power. The term, of course, is no longer used to accurately describe any real graphic process. However, as far as nostalgia goes, you can say blast processing and immediately make a buck. The term is still used in many ways, including on quite a few t-shirts, and even this blast processing is for lovers gift box. You know, if I ever said that to my wife, she'd probably never speak to me again, and I wouldn't blame her one bit. To their infinite credit, even Sega got in on the joke. Sega ultimately fell to Nintendo and stopped making consoles in 2001, switching to becoming a third-party developer for many systems, including Nintendo. As a quick aside, if you ever told me in 1991 that Sega and Mario would appear in a game together, let alone the idea that Sega would regularly make games for Nintendo, I would have bit your head off. Anyway, one of Sega's most successful, more recent games was Sonic Mania, which featured Sonic in a brand new adventure. The game was praised by critics as being able to intermingle nostalgia and a modern feel. And, even better, if you bought a Switch copy of the game, you could find the reversible game cover that looked like it was from a 1990s Sega video game. Look on the back of the cover, and you'll find a reference to blast processing. We've come full circle.